these roads. But we've said it in every capacity. We've said it anywhere we could be heard. And I think Commissioner Fye basically just said, we heard you guys, but the state doesn't care. And so I always struggle with how much energy do we continue to push here? And are we speaking to the right audience? I don't know if that answers your question.
It's like I say, Mayor Beatty, at this point with the RTAC, we think we're talking to a wall, or we're just, saying that's nice, we'll consider it, and let's move on with this agenda so we can get tolling going by next year. Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, it just, well, I have some concerns with the way the OTC is proceeding on this, and particularly in conjunction with the fact that they say they're not going to have any tolls off peak times. I think one of the things to ask for would be, at least at a start, a revenue projection of what they anticipate to get in terms of revenues if they have, as Mayor Delane pointed out, no tolls up to 400% and no tolls after hours. And then, at least provide revenue projections for the different scenarios that have been proposed by the mayor's group. I mean, because I think it would be important to understand, it may be that there's not enough money to even bother with the program.
Right. I missed the last RTAC mayor meeting, but Mayor Lou was in my stead. And I know they came up with some projections of money that came into serious question, especially revenues on the 205 bridge, where Clackamas County did some napkin math and came up with one number. ODOT presented another number. And the question is about the significant fraction taken away for administration. And I know they had other revenue projections. I haven't had a chance to read the meeting minutes yet, but Mayor Lou, am I correct in that, what I heard about what happened in the meeting?
Well, I will say all of their revenue projections were based on net revenue. And I pushed really hard to ask for, well, what is gross revenue? And what are you considering net revenue? What are you taking out of it? And they just sort of alluded to, fees and the cost of doing business, but they didn't actually tell us like what that amount was and where it was going and what the restrictions were. And it got, I think the meeting was just in generally very heated, where all of us elected officials and those at the table were asking, show us your work, show us how you're getting these assumptions, even though they're basic assumptions, we deserve to know. And they said, yeah, well, we hear you, we'll get that to you. And I don't know that they've provided that so far.
No, they are, Mayor Rory from West Lynn filed a FOIA request for their numbers, and they're really pushing back on answering that FOIA request. I guess they have 15 days to respond, and they're actively trying to avoid having to respond, even bypassing the mayor and going to his city manager, going to John Williams, try to end run them on this request. So obviously there's something, my mind is maybe they can't defend some of these numbers that they're giving us. And that's why they were reluctant to give this information to the city of West Lynn. But I know we're going on a tangent here, but those folks who feel passionately about the 400%, please remember, tomorrow, 1:30 to 5. I think they do public comment at the end. Maybe take a few minutes out and testify, in support of the 400%, not a fraction at the 200%, and a sub fraction of that at 400%. So please stay involved. Like Mary Beatty says, we can keep barking at the wall, but hopefully some of this will sink into their heads. If not, at least we gave it a shot. All right, so that brings us to item B, the Metro Urban Growth Report update. I'm going to introduce Tim Reed and Aaron Kyle from Metro, who provided an update on the growth capacity study. Stephen.
So, Chair Beeman, I don't think we have our Metro presenters online yet, so we may want to move on to the next item, and then we can
circle back.
Come back.
All right. We'll table B for now to Metro comes online. That brings us to the MSTIP 2328 Project Prioritization Discussion. We all saw each other in person finally after 3 years or so last week, and here's a follow-up. Welcome, Jessica and Stephen.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll kick us off. And again, I do want to express appreciation for all those who were able to attend in person. It really is good to just be together and be able to have those conversations in person. So thank you again for that. So one of the topics on your retreat agenda last week, and there's a couple of things actually that we may want to just touch base on. We had a little bit of discussion around potential bylaw amendments, and maybe we can come back to that under our item D. And then, of course, one of the key focal points was the conversation around WCCC project priorities. And so we asked at the end of that meeting, you all had a chance to go around, look at project information boards, connect with staff members to answer questions. And then we looked for some input on the potential priority projects, or sort of a preference survey. So Jessica has taken a look at the preference surveys that we received back and done a little bit of compiling. And so really this is just meant to help facilitate our conversation today, just to present back what we heard from you. And then we're just looking forward to some discussion and questions. And so where this is leading to, ultimately, we'd like to come back to you in January with a more refined project recommendation for your consideration. And between now and then, we'll also be working with the TAC, the staff committee, to help refine a recommendation that we bring back to your body in January. And then, of course, in January, we'll be asking for your recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, who are the decision makers for the process. So with that, I'll turn to Jessica. And I guess let me ask if there are any questions or comments right now, and then we can jump into the detail. Okay, go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen and show the preliminary results from the preference surveys that we did at the workshop. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, great. So we have all the projects listed here, of course, by district, and then the type of project, the proposed allocation, and then the count is how they fared on the preference survey. And then I've highlighted the top several projects that were the top vote getters. And then the bolded numbers here are only adding the bolded numbers here, the ones that are highlighted. So this is the sort of the preliminary results. I think, as Stephen said, we're hoping for a good discussion today. This is the sort of preliminary beginning of a staff recommendation. And so we'd like everyone to discuss and give us your feedback and input on this. One thing, and I know we talked about this a little bit at the retreat, we have several projects identified as match. And so I put in here the total with match and the total of construction. So let's just go through District 1 and District 2, and then I'll show District 3 and District 4. But one thing to consider with these match projects is whether you think we should set aside money for those projects if they are successful in getting a federal or state grant. That was the intent of these match projects, is a set aside to fund the grant match. Or should we not, and sort of do it on an ad hoc basis? If a project is successful, do we try to figure out how to fund it then? Mayor Beatty.
I just have a question on what you mean by match.
Well, for example, Farmington Road, that is a project. So these projects are really high dollar, and we know that our local match for an ODOT funded project would be around 11 million. Same with the Beaverton Hillsdale Olson Shoals Ferry intersection, that would require a big federal grant because it's such a big lift. And then the same with the 185th Max. Hillsborough can talk more about that, but that is a match, and it has other funding sources already identified to go in, but the local match identified for any federal funding is 18.7.
So are you asking us, I just want to make sure so I could think about this. You
Mhm.
want matched equal to what's here on the project, or 50% or 25?
Oh,
Like, what
that's a
does that
good
mean to
question.
you?
This is actually the amount of match that would be required for, is estimated to be required for the grant. So the local commitment required. So the grant, this would be, I guess, Stephen, I don't know that much about the Farmington project in particular, but I think that's probably the 20% match.
That may actually be a 10% match number. I think we're estimating that project to be something in the $50+ million range. So I think that was the idea of it. There was a 10 to 11% match. And I think maybe this is a good segue. So one of the things that we did chat about briefly in the works or in the retreat last week was this idea of whether it makes sense to try to allocate specific projects that have a match amount associated with them, which we know doesn't pay for the full construction costs. And the matches are also an opportunity, not necessarily a firm commitment. So we may be asking for state or federal funds to help deliver a project, but we really have no guarantee. And honestly, our success rate with our federal grants hasn't been fantastic. We've already made several applications for projects, and so we're seeing marginal return on those opportunities. So one of the things that we're still mulling is the idea of creating a large project match fund that would function as a sort of large project opportunity fund, in addition to continuing to have the small project matching fund, if you will, that we currently have, and then identify specifically projects that we believe are ready to move forward with local funding, or where there's already a federal or state funding source identified and confirmed for those projects. So if we were to move forward with, let's say, selecting the Farmington Road project, we'd be potentially committing $11 million to just sit there with a hope that we'll be successful in securing additional outside funding. And at some point in the several years ahead of us, if we determine that it just doesn't seem likely that's going to happen, then we may need to think about how to reprioritize the funding and or the project. I hope that makes sense.
Just one question on that. Would there be on each match a different sort of fish or cut bait deadline?
Probably. I think that's one of the things that we're sort of grappling with, is trying to assess for what would be the criteria to make a decision whether we hold on to that money for that particular project, or whether we, consider what the alternative allocation opportunities might look like.
But it probably would be on a project by project basis.
Right. I think that's true. So some projects may be really good federal candidates, and the federal funding will likely be mostly allocated by, say, 2026. So that may tell us something about some of those projects. Farmington Road, for instance, we're hopeful might be an opportunity for a state legislative request as a part of the 2025 package, given that's an opportunity to remove a facility from ODOT's ownership into county ownership.
I understand that the 185th overcrossing is a 20% match. This represents a 20% match of an $87 million project, about 80%. But I think it has a high degree of, I think the federal funding would be easier for something like that. Is that your perception, or?
It's really, really challenging. I think Councilor Van Beverman, I know Mayor Callaway was at the meeting last week, and we talked a little bit about the sort of challenges of trying to piece together a program when we have a lot of unknowns and variables. And even when we feel we have a degree of certainty, there are still things that just happen along the way that are somewhat beyond our control. So this process really is like a kind of like a three-dimensional Tetris game, where we're just oftentimes trying to figure out the right project at the right time for the right funding source, and needing to have some recognition of the need to be flexible as we move forward. Even though we're saying these are the priority projects, we just need to have a a degree of flexibility and some nimbleness, and a process, of course, whereby we continue to check back in both with the WCCC and of course with the board for decisions about how to make adjustments along the way.
Yeah, it's an important project that bridges a couple of municipalities in Washington County as well. So we're hopeful.
Mayor Bay, I see your hand up.
You know, I've been pretty successful at pulling down federal funding. Actually, probably one of the most successful at pulling down federal funding. I would say, like for my project, you know, we have $6 million of congressional directed spending. We got a raise planning grant. We know that the sweet spot for raise construction grant is around 30 million. And so for us to be able to bring down another 13 million puts our ask in a reasonable guide path to get there. But again, I have a full tilt lobbying team that works for me and with me. My concern is if we put that kind of requirement here, it would benefit the city of Beaverton, obviously, but it could hurt some of our smaller municipalities that don't have the resources that we do. And so I think it's really challenging. You know, we tried for Canyon Road back when it was a Tiger grant 3 times and we were unsuccessful, or maybe it was 2. And so it's really hard. It's really about lobbying the federal delegation. It's really about making your project well known. And I don't know if every city has the capacity to do that. And so how do we reconcile that? When I look at this list, mine probably has in District 1 the highest chance of getting federal funding. When I look at District 2, it probably is the max overland crossing for Hillsborough. And so I just want to caution us, if we go down that path, it's going to continue to benefit big cities. And again, that benefits me, but I'm worried about my friends in West Plains or in North Plains and Forest Grove that might not have the capacity to do that. And their projects are really important and they're just as meaningful.
That's a really good point, Mayor. And I think as we developed this list, the preliminary list at the TAC level, there was a lot of discussion and consideration given to whether, identifying which projects were good match fund opportunities, which might be suitable for various sort of federal or state programs that we either know about today or anticipate could be forthcoming. And so I think, for instance, like the Beaverton, the Downtown Loop project was a design and construction project, because I think that is then now using local funds, if you will, to sort of build on the federally, congressionally directed funds that you mentioned already, to help complete a funding gap for that project. At Farmington Road, we just view that as an opportunity to really do a much larger leverage of, hopefully state funds for that project, although it could also be quite competitive under one or more of the federal programs too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move down to District 3 and 4. Those don't actually have match projects that rose to the top. These are all identified for design and construction. So this one in particular, Highway 47, is, I think, pretty much through final design and ready to roll into construction. And some of these, as we've noted in the project tables that we had at the retreat, were previously funded for design through MSTIP. And so we have identified some on here that were preliminary design only. That sort of feeds that pipeline. I don't think any of those projects for preliminary design rose to the top in this round, but the ones that are identified here would be design and construction. So for discussion purposes, every district is relatively close on construction dollars in these preliminary results. District 1 at 37, District 2 at 40, District 3 is a little over at 50, District 4 at 39.
So I think maybe as a continued discussion, it may be helpful for us if you have additional thoughts about this idea of the large match bucket versus allocating specific projects for construction. And one of the tasks for us as staff, obviously, as we're trying to shape a recommendation to bring back to you, we'll be trying to just best fit the sort of anticipated financial capacity of a program as we move forward. And so there may just need to be adjustments made as we're refining our recommendation here. But we very much value your feedback and your thoughts and questions around this match issue.
Mayor Lou.
You know, I support the idea of the match in general. I think it's really important when we're going after really expensive projects that we need in the region that we can't necessarily fund ourselves. But I also worry about, you know, the time value of money and setting aside, you know, $11 million now, where if it goes back in the pot in a couple of years, the value of those $11 million aren't going to go nearly as far. So I think I agree with the match. I do have the same concerns as Mayor Beatty, just as far as the capacity to be able to go after these. And so I would say if there, or suggest for some refinement, if something goes into here as a match, that there needs to be a robust plan over what you're going to go after and sort of the timeline of like when it goes back if you don't receive the funds. So there isn't any squishy questions about the future. So for instance, you're going after this raise grant or this from the state or this, and if you don't meet these milestones, like it automatically goes back in, just so there's no question about it. Because again, I do worry. I think it's challenging to get these grants. And as we've seen construction costs just skyrocket, the value of our money goes down the longer we wait for construction.
Mayor Rosner. You're up, Tim. And then Jeff after Tim.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Heidi, you read my mind. I'm setting aside money for long periods of time. When you think about the inflation and the value, it's not just the inflation dollars, it's the cost of construction, as you pointed out. And, you know, I've watched our ED Road project go, it started around 7 million, now it's at 14 million. So the longer you wait to spend the money, the less value you're getting out of it. So from that perspective, I'm not comfortable with the match program as it's defined. I do think we need to be thoughtful about which projects we think will qualify for match and price them accordingly. But the smaller cities don't have that ability, not just because they don't have the staff, as Mayor Beatty pointed out, just you don't have the clout. You know, you're not going to get listened to as much as, say, Beaverton or Hillsborough in Washington. So I think we need to make sure these smaller projects get done as well.
Jeff?
I think they came in as a match project. We leave them as match projects. But I think to what the others are saying is they can't sit there for 6-8 years waiting to get matched, right? I think you put, you know, I don't know if the right answer is a 2-year time limit. To Heidi's point, right, about there's got to be a plan and what you think you're going to do. And if that plan doesn't succeed, then I think it falls back into the next tier of these. They're all good projects, right? There's a ton of good projects here. But I think as far as what happens to that money, it goes back into the program, because I think all of us are pretty cognizant of the fact that there will be project overruns and there will be cost inflation on these projects. And if a $10 or $20 million match doesn't come to fruition because we don't get the other money that has been thought of to be programmed, it'll probably be money that we need to pay construction increases and cost overruns, basically as a contingencies in these. So I'd be fine with giving them, like, I'm pulling a number out of the air, maybe give them a 24-month life. And if they don't get their matches, then the money goes back into the program and then we'll readdress what we do with it at that point. But to hold additional money out, I don't want to hold additional money out and then take our ability to not get some of these projects done that are design and construction, you know, complete, right, to actually get things done. So I'm up for giving them a couple of years, but not a lot longer.
I think we might have a question then related to this. So I think we are targeting roughly 40 million per commissioner district. So that's why I have the $2 figures here. If we want to keep one or more of the match projects, then there might need to be some trade-offs of what gets constructed. so that the value of the investment and just what we can actually provide per commissioner district is roughly the 40 million. And again, as we talked about at the retreat, we won't have a full answer on this until our budget process is completed, but that's basically our target.
I don't know about the others, but I'm comfortable with the filtering we've done at this point to push it forward as published, you know, with the, maybe it's a little bit of overage. And then if we need to trim again when it comes back, then we can have another discussion if we need to.
Councilman Bevan.
Forgive me, I understand that there's the opportunity to bond in 3 different scenarios with respect to bonding. Does that affect how much is in the pool and how much we can set aside for match?
The bonding is really geared toward trying to catch up on our prior projects that are already underway, where we've just identified, for all the reasons that we've heard here, cost escalation and inflation and some project delays, where our estimates for the projects that we already have in our prior MSTIP project list are just costing significantly more to deliver than we estimated.
Yeah,
And I would,
I just didn't know if there was any provision for.
Yeah, so at this point, we're sort of assuming that we continue with something more like a pay-as-you-go program for future projects. And there may be some variations on that theme, but for right now, for planning purposes, that's sort of what we're trying to build our proposal around.
Thanks.
Mayor Rosner.
I think my question was answered.
Right. So the question I have, and this might be the next slide, Stephen and Jessica, is we did this. We also did the top 10 over the county overall. We're going to see that one too, or just this one?
I
can
apologize.
answer. Yeah, I basically just mashed the results together because they were very similar. And
Okay.
I guess I would point out that between the TAC preference surveys and the WCCC preference surveys, the top projects were the same, except for the TAC preferred, they wanted to include the 205th Avenue Bridge. WCCC included North 19th Avenue. So those were the only 2 that were different. So I have included them both here for discussion purposes.
All right. So these are the ones in blue are the top projects across the county.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I do have another question, Frank, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, obviously District 3 is a little bit over with our 3 projects. And I'm new to this year, so maybe it's a boneheaded question, but will we have an opportunity to say, okay, maybe we need to look at the scope of these projects? If these 3 projects, for instance, in District 3 are a priority for us, can we look at the scope of those in terms of getting down to more of a $40 million number?
Yes, I would say the answer is a definite yes. I think as we're looking at those 3 projects, I think we do have to be realistic and not over allocate. So I do think we would probably want to meet with the 3 jurisdictions. I think these are all 3 different cities, and maybe have a discussion around the project scopes and potential funding allocation amounts.
And then I would add, even though we haven't identified these as a match, we have had some success in Sherwood in getting matching federal funds, and I'm sure Tigard and Beaverton have too. So I'm assuming there's the opportunity to throw a match against that if we can.
Yes, yeah, and that's a really good point. I think we've maybe mentioned this a couple times, but in the MSTIP 3E program that the board approved in particular, there were some commitments from some of our partner jurisdictions to put up a certain amount of funding to almost leverage, if you will, the MSTIP funding to try to help deliver some projects that were priorities for the local jurisdiction, and just to help, if you will, facilitate cost sharing in those projects. So that's certainly an opportunity as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
So Stephen and Jessica, when you come back in January, will you have any better idea from the commissioners about the 40 million per district? Because I mean, part of it to me would be before, and you know, we'll pick on District 3 before we try to get this down to 40 million. I'd rather know what the definite number is first from the commissioners, and then rather than do this twice, we do it once. And I guess the other 3 districts would be the same thing. If 40 is too high and ends up being 30 per district, then all 4 districts are gonna have to do some scope changes and stuff like that to meet what the commissioners are, putting forward as the total dollar amount per district for the next round of MSTIP, correct?
Yes, so this is complicated, to your point, so I don't know that we'll
It
have
goes to your
hard-
Tetris idea.
Yeah, so I don't know that I'll have hard target numbers in January. I think, again, we're making some assumptions based on past practice and reasonable assumptions about how we move forward. Those are all, of course, subject to discussion and vetting with the board. But I think where we'd like to get to is, and I think this process has been very helpful in terms of just getting a good sense of the relative project priorities. And as the funding, say, scales or, one way or another, I think we'll be in a good place to be able to have a thoughtful conversation about how to make adjustments to the project list to right size it to the project budget. And as I know I've mentioned, we at the county are sort of transitioning into an annual capital improvement program review process. So I think that actually is a really good place to build in checkpoints for us, both with the coordinating committee and with the board, to just bring up conversations about, okay, the present reality looks a little bit different than we thought a year ago. So we need to consider some potential adjustments and to have those conversations in real time as we move forward through the program.
And has the board had the discussion about putting a framework around match projects, or is you starting with us? And
Yeah,
then
we're really,
think.
Yeah, we're starting with the committee here and trying to get a good sense, and we really appreciate the feedback that you've given us thinking about the various pros and cons. And I think that will be really helpful to inform our discussions that'll be coming up with our board.
Okay. So do you have what you need from us right now, or?
I think this has been quite helpful. Yes, thank you. And I'd noticed, Councilor Rosenthal, your hand was up. Did you have a final comment here? Okay.
I was assuming it was just stuck up there.
Just forgot to take it down. Sorry.
No worries.
All right. Has Metro entered the building?
I don't think we have both of our presenters yet. We're expecting them to be online by 1 o'clock. So if you're open to it, I think we could go ahead and move forward with.
Yeah, let's go ahead to D, forward-looking work plan. You 2 on a roll, so keep going.
All right. So I'm going to look to Jessica here as well. So as you know, in your agenda packet, and this is a more recent practice that we're trying to be disciplined about, is thinking about a look forward plan for the committee. And this is very similar to what JPACT and IMPACT do, so that they have, I think they call theirs a work plan. We've called it future agenda topics. But irregardless, just trying to think about what are the upcoming regional initiatives or priorities for us as a county that you may want to try to ensure that we're able to carve out some time for discussion. And I would say, certainly this past year, we had a lot of time absorbed doing things like tolling and RTP and the high capacity transit study. So there are a lot of things that come to this committee that are just sort of processes driven by others and we need to be responsive to. And then there's a little bit of time oftentimes for the committee to somewhat self-direct. And so that's maybe where we have some opportunity to, again, think about what your relative priorities might look like. So go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, yeah, I think, Teresa, do you want to share just the middle slide? We have just put up some questions on a slide to direct the discussion. Okay. So basically, just to direct the roundtable discussion about Are there any topics that you would like to discuss over the next year or two? What is the relative priority of those topics? And do you have any suggestions for outside speakers on those topics? And-
Before I get to Jeff, some of the things we talked about in prep for this meeting, some of the ideas we tossed around was meetings, to discuss what's going on or be preemptive on the 2025 legislative session, land use rules, the governor's housing production goals, the 2024 urban growth report. Those, for example, those are the kind of things we're saying, do we need, or do we want to set aside time to discuss that and be more a little proactive than reactive? So Jeff, go ahead, you're up first, and then, well, Tim was up, but Tim put his hand down. Oh, it's back up again. Jeff and Tim, start it off.
I would be remiss not to take the opportunity to go, wow, we've already blown out our urban and rural reserves. When are we going to start talking about that? And I think that wraps around a lot of the topics that you brought up, Frank, was right. The housing, the jobs production, all that, we've been pitching, hundreds and hundreds of acres of expansion, but we're done, right? We're based on the proposals that went through in 2014, Cornelius is basically off the table. So unless we're going to have another look at our 50-year horizon that what got burned up in 10 years. Oh, wait, the governor and everybody's already admitted that we're way, way, way behind in housing production. So I think that would be something that would be supreme to us, is looking at where is everybody else and really getting that discussion across the board, right? I know exactly where we are, but I don't have a good understanding where Beaverton and Hillsborough and Tigard, Sherwood, Tualatin, and all the rest of the in-region ones are. And then we've talked a little bit about the ones that are outside, right? I know that North Plains is working on some stuff. I don't know what Gaston's working on. I don't know what Banks is working on. So I think having a time for us all to discuss about where we're looking at in that 50-year horizon of trying to figure out how do we get more housing production out there would be paramount, I think.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Rosner.
Yeah, Jeff just brought up a lot of what I was going to talk about at a very high level. I mean, there's some tactical stuff for this session, like LC19, the governor's housing framework that they've been working with a lot of jurisdictions on, that I think is something important for us to track during the short session here. So I just add that as a point of detail.
Okay, Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, 2 points. One to Mayor Delane's comment. It might also want to hear a little bit on what cities like Newburgh and Woodburn are proposing, since they seem to drive people into the region and affect what we do. I've been that's something that I'd be curious about at any rate. But the main other issue I would point out is possibly waste management. As you know, the Metro is going through a reevaluation of what our waste management strategies are, and one of the issues are regionalization of self-haul and reduce, reuse, and recycle facilities. As you know, that Mayor Delane knows, we have a property in Cornelius that has been undecided for a while.
All right. Others.
I can't pass it up when Garrett tees it up like that my community is driving to, oh, Garrett already said it, Newburgh and Yamhill to do their self-haul, because the rates are so ridiculous out in our end that it's cheaper to drive down to Yamhill and Newburgh to get rid of your self-haul items than it is to go to any of the transfer station in our area. Or it's crazy, right? That people are going there. And to Garrett's point, right, we just saw Newburgh just pass in one county meeting 100-acre expansion. So yeah, they're just adding land and going forward.
Mm-hmm. Mayor Beatty.
I'm just wondering how that might fit into this committee and our ability to impact it. I mean, I get we're a bunch of mayors and we like to talk about all things, but is the intertie that people are driving on the roads?
Is it like we do talk land use? Could you segue into land use perhaps?
Well, that's what I'm trying to wonder. Does this actually fit into the?
I think Garrett's maybe his point about the waste and stuff is what do we want to have as a program in our community, right? Do we have the program we want? And at what cost? Because the bell we keep ringing is, you know, my people are literally driving out of the county to another county to get rid of waste because it's cheaper. And somehow those counties seem to be doing it for a fourth of what we're doing it. I mean, my dad's in Deschutes County, Klamath County. They're all doing it for about a fourth the cost we are. So where is the other 3/4 of the money? Are we just, we don't understand, right? So how does that tie into our total services where you can go to the landfill in Deschutes or Yamhill for a quarter of what it costs to go here? So where's all that money go?
Well, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think I've written a TED talk on the lack of options around waste and losing our mixed use recycling. I mean, obviously, I'm going to not call out the elephant in the room of why I think it costs more expensive. It was driven by maybe the member that brought it up, but I want to make sure that our valuable time that is very much a mayor's problem. I very much understand why we'd want to talk about it. I just don't know if it fits into I mean, if you guys want to go ahead, I'm just saying, like, I have a hard time jumping the bridge into this committee.
Steven?
Maybe it's the prioritization of these things, right? If we find ourselves with time in June we don't know what to do with, maybe we're talking about that then.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was just going to say in response to Mayor Beatty's question, so the charge, if you will, the bylaws for the committee do talk about as a place to review and comment on major land use and transportation issues, plans, and projects, and provide a forum for discussion on these, resulting in recommendations for a coordinated approach when appropriate. So I think there's a component of land use that comes into this. Waste management is sort of on the periphery. Certainly there's a big land use component to it. There's a big transportation component to it, but it doesn't exactly fall into what I would call the more narrowly defined land use and transportation realm.
Councilor Van Beveren.
Yeah, I'm not a regular participant. I'm just curious about how we're going to fund the future of things like the capital improvement projects that MSTIP typically funds. Is there any discussion of any supplemental funding source or a new approach? Or, I mean, it seems like a lot of the transportation funding is stalled in one way or another, whether it's tolling or gas tax or vehicle miles traveled. It's just frustrating to me, and especially in Washington County, where we've done so well with the MSTIP program. Is that discussion taking place anywhere in our county among electeds, saying how do we fund these future projects?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
dovetail into that, obviously being made aware of the county's budget process when you're launching into the next fiscal year and potential impacts to MSTIP and the library system. So that's definitely something that I think should be on our radar, is the county's budget situation and any more potential cuts that we should be aware of, or movement of money, going toward Councilor Van Beveren's point of the funding sources for these transportation projects.
Yes, and I think we didn't try to start populating a draft list necessarily, right, but I think one of the topics that certainly will be of interest this coming year is certainly going to be the state transportation package for anticipated in the long session in 2025. So we think that's a great topic to bring back to this committee as we're starting to think about how to shape and size local priorities again in that, and how to keep the local agencies engaged in that process, so that if there are changes made in the state funding structure, how do we ensure that the local entities aren't left behind, that we continue revenue sharing, that we continue various other important avenues for securing local funding for transportation. But that may also be a really good forum to just have a more broad discussion around transportation funding generally.
Okay. I know the Metro folks will be here with an update on the urban growth report update. When is that supposed to be done and finalized and headed towards Metro Council for review and approval, because that'd be something I think we'd want to see the end product after these updates, we've been getting periodically. Going back to the, Jeff's UGB concerns. Other folks. You guys are quiet this morning or this afternoon.
Yeah, one more while we're thinking about transportation funding. So the JPAC trip is expected, I believe, probably in May, June timeframe. And so again, that may be another opportunity for us to discuss as a committee, or you all to discuss as a committee, the potential priorities for going back to DC again this year.
Okay. Mayor Beatty.
Since you brought up JPAC, I am wondering if, our goals here don't always necessarily align with all of total of JPAC. And I don't think taking our projects and shoving them into JPAC's priorities necessarily get us what we want here for Washington County. And so perhaps there's a way of thinking about either an add-on day or some other kind of way where Washington County could go and present. I just think that I'm not a member of JPAC, but I'm a large enough city. I always get invited. But again, not everyone on this call gets that opportunity. And I'm in it for the region. I'm also in it for Washington County, and we're going to get drummed out by everyone else. So if we're thinking about the best way to bring our plans forward, perhaps it's a WCCC trip where a few of us go back, or we add it to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, or some other position where we could go and have the audience. I don't think relying on JPAC gets us what we want.
I love that idea.
Steve's not here to push back.
That's a great idea.
Well, I was just going to add, I did go on the JPAC trip this year, and Washington County did coordinate its own day. So did the JPAC thing, and then there was our own day where we visited on behalf of the county. So that piece of it has already been done.
And we've done that for a long time. We've always had a Washington County Day before or after the JPAC trip historically. So
doesn't that feel like you're kind of, do you get the response you think out of our delegation when you go back to back and say, this is our regional priorities? Just kidding. This is Washington County's.
Well,
no, I think it's done not as a cut the throat of one for the other. Maybe that's a bad way of thinking about it, but one is a focus on what's important to the region as a whole, and the other is we're talking about specifics of the Washington County priorities. And if the Washington County transportation priorities don't align with JPAC, that's probably a bigger discussion that we need to have, because usually there is a likely alignment. And then we do talk about other things. Historically, we'll talk about it. We've talked about the dam. We've talked about some other stuff in addition, right? Bolting on some things that are not JPAC specific, but are priorities that are very important to the county as a whole.
It also gives you, I know we were all jaws dropped, with Representative Blumenauer, but he was to the point that he goes, these are all nice, but you get one. Which one's it going to be? He was cut and dry. JPAC, obviously, you want that bridge. That's going to be your one project you're going to get. And then when he met with us again for the Washington County, he's like, I've got lots of people coming in here asking for money. What makes you special? And maybe, to Mayor Beatty's point, we do a better job of saying, what makes us special, what not coming with this laundry list that they're going to be like, there's no way this is all going to get done. What are those things that are near and dear to you that I can endorse? Because I thought Earl was terrific at doing that. In a way we didn't like it, but he was honest, and I appreciated it.
Now, I might add, I know last year we probably could have been a little bit better organized in putting together the trip. And so, yeah, we did have the Washington County Day after the JPAC delegation meetings. And I think you're right. It's important that there's a sense of alignment with the county day and the regional priorities. And so the regional priorities, by virtue of there being quite a few of them, you have to sort of touch them all very lightly in any briefings that you have. And so the second day may be an opportunity just to really help to unpack the Washington County components of that. regional priority list. And there may be a couple of other side priorities, I suppose. But you're right, it is, we heard loud and clear from Representative Blumenauer that it's important to really be focused on what are the very few things that you think you really want as a county and within a region.
Yeah. So any other ideas for looking forward work plan items? All right. Not seeing any hands up. So does that bring us? So we near 1 o'clock right now. Is Metro here yet, Stephen?
We are. We do have our Metro
All right.
attendees here. So I'll ask if we haven't promoted them up yet. Let's go ahead and do that. And then I think we're ready to move to, oh, which item number was that?
B.
B, thank you. Give just a minute here for folks to get set up.
Welcome, Ted and Erin.
Hi, thank you very much for having us.
Sure.
So I'm Erin Key. I'm Urban Policy and Development Manager at Metro, which means I'm one of the managers in our Planning, Research and Development Department at Metro. And Ted Reed is leading this urban growth boundary decision-making process that is going to continue for the next year. We're going to go over the basics of that schedule. I heard you talking a little bit about wondering what that schedule was going to be. So we'll make sure we'll go over that first thing. And then the other part of our visit is to be here to explain how we approach what some of the assumptions are that go into the analysis that occurs before the Metro Council makes an urban growth boundary decision. We're out here to visiting you and visiting others around the region to explain the process while we're doing the work, as a way of making sure that when the results come out, you understand kind of some of the process that went into them, and you have a chance to ask questions and critically look at this data and information, understanding how it comes together. So that's why we're here. Try to answer all your questions if we can about this piece of the process. So I'm going to go over the whole thing here in just a second, and then we're going to dive into one part of the analysis, explain it, and then take your questions about it. And we're happy to stay for questions as long as you guys have on your agenda for us. So that one topic that we're going to dive into is land capacity. And I'm going to talk about why that's such an important part of the decision in just a second. So let's go to the next slide, where I'm going to show you a schedule. This was a big question that just came up. The Metro Council needs to make a decision about the urban growth boundary by December of 2024, so a year from now. That's 6 years from the last UGB decision in 2018. And that's the schedule that we're on, to have a major look at the urban growth boundary every 6 years. When we make this decision, the Metro Council has the capacity to bring in areas of urban reserves into the urban growth boundary. That's what they have the capacity to do during that decision making. The decision making is dictated in many ways by state law that requires us to do a very particular analysis. And so all of this navy blue in the schedule is that analysis, and it results in a report called the Urban Growth Report, which is shown here as an acronym, where there's a blue star. It says Draft UGR Public Comment Period. So that's when that draft report is released. All of this navy blue is the preparation of that report, pulling together information about future anticipated growth and land capacity, which I'm going to dive into. Ted and I are going to dive into in just a few minutes. We also take proposals from cities that are interested in expanding. We received a letter of interest from the city of Sherwood at the beginning of December, and that was the only letter of interest we received. So that is the proposal that we're expecting to receive in April, is something from the city of Sherwood related to the concept planning that they've been doing for several years. So some portion or part or full concept plan. We're going to wait and see what the city of Sherwood decides. So that's in the green. So proposals are due in April of 2024. Those letters of interest were due at the beginning of this month. And there's lots of different ways that we have folks plugged in. We're regularly giving updates to MPAC and to MTAC. CORE is Metro's Committee on Racial Equity. We have a land use technical advisory group, which includes staff from all of your jurisdictions that we've invited to participate, all of the cities and counties in the Metro region, invited to, help us approach this analysis, check our methods, give us very, very useful local information. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's involved in the land capacity in just a minute. We're happy to come back to this group anytime you'll have us to give you an update through this next year's process. We have a stakeholder roundtable that has several members from Washington County. Some folks in this room are sitting on that table too. I just saw Mayor Rosner. Oh, there you are. It's funny how sometimes the little boxes move and you think you know where someone is, and then anyway, we're also engaging a youth cohort. Anyway, you can see that we're out here doing these presentations quite a bit. That's the point I wanted to make. Next slide. Okay, so the urban growth report focuses on 3 main categories, if I'm going to simplify it: readiness, demand, and capacity. The urban growth report is a decision-making tool, so it brings information and data before the Metro Council in order for them to make a decision about whether there's enough room inside the growth boundary for 20 years of future growth, or if the boundary needs to be expanded into urban reserves to allow enough land for expected growth. That's really, I'm going to get to that in the next slide, I think. So readiness, that's the capacity inside the growth boundary to accept that growth. The demand is our estimates of what that growth will be for over the next 20 years, which is quite a long time period. And readiness is about the cities who are ready to take this expansion, who are ready to grow, who have plans in place, like a concept plan to begin the process of bringing those areas quickly into employment, use, and housing as soon as possible after the growth boundary is expanded. So today we're going to focus a bit on this capacity topic. Next slide. This slide shows you the very basic state requirement of us. Just like other cities around the state who have urban growth boundaries, the state law in its most simplest form says that you need to understand how much you're going to grow. I said this, 20 years worth of growth is your demand. You figure out how much land you have inside the UGB, your existing UGB that's buildable, that still has space to accommodate that growth in housing and in jobs. And you do a math equation. If you don't have enough land to take that anticipated growth, if your math equation, your subtraction equation here results in a number, then that's the amount of land that you need to bring into your urban growth boundary. Obviously, it's not that simple, because how we could all probably disagree on how much our region will grow or not in the next 20 years. That's even our best economists will slightly disagree, but we're going to bring the best minds together to work on these numbers. But obviously it's still really very educated estimations of what we think might happen and what we think is possible inside the existing urban growth boundary, because it is also very difficult to anticipate what growth will be. So it's not perfect, and we're going to give our council a range. The urban growth report, when it comes out, will have all of this information in a range to help help you, the public, weigh in on this decision and to help the Metro Council make its choice. Next slide. So going back to this one, the urban growth report will have all of these elements. It will talk about demand and growth. It will talk about capacity of land inside the growth boundary. And it will talk about the readiness of cities giving us proposals that they're ready to bring areas into the growth boundary. So we're going to focus now going forward with this presentation on the capacity piece. And there are it's very complex. There are over 500,000 parcels inside the urban growth boundary. in the metro area. And so that's a lot of individual properties to try to understand. We can't do it property by property. We have to put together a model, a computer model that makes assumptions and does probabilities to figure out what we think the developable land inside the growth boundary is. But it's kind of an interesting process how we get there, and Ted is going to walk us through. So next slide. I hope this is okay, Ted. I think I was supposed to pass to you on the last one.
No, you did it correctly. Thank you, Aaron. So again, I'm Ted Reed in the group in Metro's Planning Development Research Department that Aaron manages. And I'm project manager for this urban growth management decision. And as Aaron noted, we want to tell you a bit about how we go about estimating growth capacity in the urban growth boundary and some of what that review processes look like. So as a bit of context, though, it's helpful to remember how this is done in the rest of the state. It's a fairly straightforward process that basically looks at whether land is vacant, removes portions of those vacant lands that aren't developable because of environmental constraints, and then just assuming, well, the zoning allows 5 units here, that's our capacity. In our region, we get a lot more housing and job development through redevelopment and infill, and so that introduces some interesting market factors. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about the scale of that sort of redevelopment and infill and its impact on our growth capacity. This is looking back from the 2009 to 2023 time period. This is housing permit activity. So if you see a peak, the purplish colors, that's essentially more housing permitting activity happening over that historic time frame. So a lot of this is existing communities, and I see Mayor Rosner, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great chart, and you also presented this to the MPAC, which was great. I was just curious, do you have this heat map by housing type? It'd be really interesting to see what this looks like by like multifamily, whatever, cottage cluster, single family detached, and just kind of see what those patterns look like.
That's a good suggestion. I don't have that, but I'll ask our research staff if that's something they could do.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so a lot of housing development in our existing communities. These are places that you all know: North Bethany, Renko Town Center, Amber Glen, Villebois, and then of course close in Portland has seen a lot of housing development in recent decades as well. Next slide, please. And these are just some quick visual examples of what that housing development has looked like. So you're going to see before and after pictures of the same location. This is before and after in Amber Glen 2016 to 2021. Again, just visual examples of development around the region. Next slide, please. North Mississippi in Portland. So an example of development in a already dense urban environment. Next slide. In Milwaukee, down south. Next slide. Out in the Happy Valley area in Clackamas County. Next slide. So because so much of our growth happens through redevelopment and infill, we really want to emphasize this point that our goal is not to get it right regarding every single parcel in the region, because we do have to do so much basically financial analysis about feasibility of development. We're not just looking at, well, here's some vacant land and here are the environmental constraints. This is more about how might the market react over the next 20 years. So we really aim for accuracy, generally getting it right. As a region, we're going to get some redevelopment candidates identified that may not develop over the next 20 years, and the opposite is also true. We may not identify some parcels as redevelopment candidates, and they will redevelop. So we want general accuracy at the regional scale, not trying to pinpoint parcel by parcel. It's definitely going to happen here, definitely not going to happen there. So we try to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the process we go through. I'm going to walk through each of these steps in subsequent slides, so I won't speak to each of these, but just very generally, there are a couple of steps here: inventorying the land itself, and then figuring out what kind of capacity you might get out of that land using a pro forma model, which is essentially a financial feasibility model that's being developed for us by Johnson Economics. It's the type of model that gets used by developers deciding whether to proceed with a particular development project. Johnson Economics has basically scaled this up to the regional scale to give us an estimation of likelihood of development over the next 20 years. Next slide. So first step in this process, we start with aerial photos of the whole region, this land inside the urban growth boundary today. And we categorize it in two categories, either vacant land or developed land. Next slide. These are the definitions that we worked out with our land use technical advisory group. Many of you have staff that participated in this advisory group. We opened it up to every city and county in the region, and we had very good representation. So the methods I'm talking about today reflect the agreement of that land use technical advisory group. So vacant land definitions. It's the stuff that you intuitively know is vacant. It's a parcel with no improvements on it, no surface parking lot. It also includes properties that are over 95% vacant. So they may have a little bit of development on them, but largely are vacant. And then the last category, and I don't think we actually had any instances of this in this inventory. Mostly vacant, over 90% vacant, and the development that is there is less than 2,000 square feet of development. So 3 different kinds of vacant land. That's how we sort things. Next slide, please. And then once we've done that, we look at pulling out land in 3 categories. Exempt lands are ones that are owned, for instance, by a rail company or by a homeowners association as common space, open space properties owned by the public are another example. Environmental constraints, these are things like steep slopes, floodways, those get recognized in this inventory as well. And then the last thing here is future rights of way. So if we have a 5-acre vacant parcel, we know that it's going to need to have a road network developed in it to support development. So this is our means of accounting for a share of that larger parcel, recognizing that not all of it will be capacity for housing, that some of it has to be devoted to future rights of way. Next slide, please. So once we have this inventory, vacant lands, developed lands, we send it out for local review. We did that earlier in the fall, and we have now closed that review process. We sent it out to all cities and counties in the region. So 24 cities, 3 counties. We got a total of 16 jurisdictions that responded. And they tend to be the jurisdictions with most of the land base. I believe everyone in this room, your jurisdictions, if you're in metro area, that is, so not North Plains, for instance. Your staff reviewed this. Their review looked at about 90% of the total land area in the boundary, as well as about 90% of the total tax lots. So we didn't hear from jurisdictions that were relatively small, Wood Village, Fairview, for instance. So we feel good about this process, that we got a good review of the vast majority of the land. We got comments back on about 5,000 of the tax lots in the inventory. So that's 5,000 out of about 500,000 where we got comments or edits. We've accepted all those. It amounted to removing about 200 acres of vacant land from our inventory based on that local review. So we see that as an indication of success that we put it out there for review. There seemed to be widespread agreement about the methods we've used that looked about right, and we got some comments and edits back that we've now incorporated into our inventory. Next slide. So we have an inventory of the land. Now we need to figure out how much capacity should we count on it. First step there is understanding what's allowable under the zoning. We don't stop there though, because we want to understand market feasibility as well. So as I mentioned, 24 cities, 3 counties in the region. So we have a lot of zoning codes out there that we need to make some sense of. So we use what we call a regional generalized zoning classification that sorts these local zoning codes into some more simple categories. And again, that's our means of understanding what's allowable on these parcels. I'll also note that we sent this generalized zoning classification out for review by all cities and counties this last spring. So any edits your staff gave are incorporated into that. Next slide, please. And this is where it starts getting interesting. The 4th step, determining capacity. And as I mentioned, we rely heavily on redevelopment and infill. That's consistent with all of your local plans to enhance your downtowns and main streets. This is what we want to see happen. And so we have to understand how the market might respond to this capacity. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have hired Johnson Economics to put together a regional pro forma model. So it takes those 2 categories of land, both vacant and developed, and we have a number of building prototypes. So for instance, townhouses or an industrial type building, warehousing distribution, or single family home. And the model then figures out of those building prototypes, which is the highest and best use that can be supported by the market. What's the financial feasibility of that type of building? And what it gives us is an estimation of the likelihood of development on all these parcels in the region. We use that to create a range of capacity because we know that there's significant uncertainty looking out 20 years. Not just because of limitations of the model, but also because there are factors that are beyond all of our control, like interest rates, that can give us very different results. Next slide. And this is the last one. I believe this is just a little bit more about the model itself. And some of what drives that assessment of financial feasibility. It looks at achievable rents and threshold rate of return. So again, we know that developers, they develop to make a profit. So this model has estimations of what they could expect to get in terms of profit, as well as the expenses that we need to go into a project, whether it's construction costs or operating expenses. And then finally, the model also takes into account property assumptions like, well, what is the allowed density and what amount of parking would be required under local zoning codes. I'm going to stop there, and we have time for questions, I believe.
Questions for Aaron or Ted? You're delaying.
Oh, maybe this is for Ted. Ted, how does the model comprehend the explosive growth in Camas and Washougal as the metropolitan area?
Thank you for the question, Mayor. So we think of that question more on the demand side. So one of the aspects that Aaron mentioned was demand, capacity, and readiness. So on the demand side, we start with a 7-county population household employment forecast. So that 7 counties includes Clark County in Washington, as well as Skamania County. And so that's all part of that regional forecast we start with. And then we try to come up with some estimate of how much of that growth is likely to come to our metro urban growth boundary. We call it the urban growth boundary capture rate. It's typically based on historic data trends as well as modeling that we do. So not part of this pro forma model that I've been talking about today, but it is an important aspect to the work that goes into the urban growth report.
I'll add that work is underway. It was one of the little boxes, the blue boxes on that schedule, and I would expect that we'll have information that we'll begin sharing from that analysis in the spring.
Does that model also include Canby, Aurora, and Newburgh's growth?
It includes, let me see if I can rattle off the counties. So there are 3 counties that you all are familiar with, as well as Skamania, Clark, Yamhill, Columbia. So that's 7, yeah.
Thank you.
Mary Lou.
Thank you. My question is kind of around land that's already in the urban growth boundary and land that's been in there for a while but hasn't been productive, how that is being calculated into what we're considering available and ready land. If it hasn't been productive in the last 20 years or so, what the anticipation is moving forward, because that has a big impact on, you know, what can be brought in if it's still valued pretty highly.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Mayor, it's an excellent point, and it's one of the reasons why we have so much focus on city readiness and why this process for the last, particularly in 2018 and this cycle, has been driven by city proposals for urban growth boundary expansions that we have learned from past cycles where the process was reversed, where we would do this calculation, add some lands that may have been challenging to serve, and then have cities do the concept planning. And a lot of those areas sat there undeveloped for many years. So we've really tried to reverse this process to start with well, what do cities have in mind for their urban reserve areas?
So, and I'll add that our intent of using this pro forma model as part of the capacity analysis is an attempt to better understand the realities of what a property faces, like the one this theoretical one that you're bringing up, a property that maybe is inside your city boundaries, but for one reason or another just has not developed. If we took the approach that many other cities in the state of Oregon use, then we would just put the zoning, whatever the zoning regulations, and said that we assume that that's what will happen on that site in 20 years. This is a little bit more subtle, saying what is going on in the market and can we make a probability estimate of what might happen on that site. Now, our success on that probably depends on what is holding that site up. There are factors that we just simply can't know, like a property owner's intent. So is that property sitting because it's stuck in lawsuits in a trust and family members are fighting over what will happen with that site? In that case, there's just no way we're going to know that. But at least we're really excited about this model. It's not something that we've been able to, this level of technology has just not been available in the past to figure this out. So we're really hopeful that we'll be able to get much better information about sites like the one you're talking about than we've ever been able to in a past UGB decision.
Thank you.
I'll take it as my turn, Frank.
I'm muted this time. You're up, Tim.
Jeff brings up a really good point. I just want to emphasize that, having done some housing development in the Camas area, when you can go from getting dirt brought into a city limits to actually starting to see rooftops in less than 24 months, it makes a lot of sense why you were seeing such explosive growth up there. But just to kind of add on to the demand question, specifically as it applies to industrial land, and I know I've covered this in the stakeholder, but it'd be interesting to see if thinking's evolved and what you guys are thinking at this point. But when we talk about industrial or jobs land, lot size is a very important component. That's part one. So how are we looking at that in terms of demand? The other side of that with demand, it's not just what's happening in our surrounding counties, it's what's happening especially for the, you know, the big whales, the big companies that we would like to see come here, what's happening in Ohio and Arizona, New York, North Carolina, and all these different states that have a different land use process. So when we think of demand, are we thinking of our competitive position?
So, Mayor, thank you for 2 questions. So the first one about parcel sizes, that typically is something that we look at in our analysis, demand for parcels of particular sizes, particularly bigger parcels on the employment side. And then your question about, I think it's about regional competitiveness nationwide and worldwide for that matter. We begin with a regional forecast that really tries to understand how much employment growth in different sectors we're likely to get. You're raising a different question though about that's, well, not so much forecast related, but how do we remain competitive? And I think that's an important one that we're trying to emphasize in our work as well, approaching it from both those angles. What's the sort of natural demand for sites, and also a question about economic development priorities.
Yeah, because I think that, you know, I think it's important on the forecast piece, because you're right, the forecast piece is based on trends, right? So it doesn't really get to demand sometimes, but when we use that forecast number as an indicator of demand in the future, that's where the problem arises. So understanding what the tools are. You've heard me on the soapbox before, but, you know, it'd be great to see something come out in the report that says, here are the kind of tools that we need to accelerate job growth, to make sure that we're competitive, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, thank you. So I appreciate it.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question, and maybe I missed it. How do you account on the vacant and developed for some of the, as you know, there's a bunch of the cities on the western side of the county that have different projects that are in different stages. Some of them are more speculative, some are actually in process. How do you account for developed versus vacant for some of the ones where development is not actually started, but is projected over the course of the next 3 or 4 or 5 years?
We look to local review, Counselor, and that's the kind of feedback that we sometimes get. In some cases, it may amount to a note attached to a particular tax law that we expect something's going to happen in the next few years, versus you need to pull this from the inventory because something already is happening here that you didn't capture in your aerial photos. But we do rely on that local review heavily for that kind of information.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, I'm not seeing any hands up. So thank you, Aaron and Ted, for this update, and looking forward to more. I didn't realize this is another year-long process.
It is.
You have year more left, so
We do.
suspect
Yeah,
we'll be hearing more from you.
You're very interested in demand, so we can come back and talk about that other piece of the puzzle. And once we have that, we'll eventually, when that urban growth report comes out, is when we can really have some very dynamic conversations about how they come together and where you think we should be on those ranges. I'm sure we'll all have opinions about where on the range we think the reality is.
All right. Well, thanks for coming today.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right. All right. So that brings us to, let's see, 4E, which is the JPAC agenda review. Mayor Callaway's not here. Commissioner Fye, have you taken a look at the agenda yet for JPAC?
Yes, I did. But I don't know if there's any significant. The staff and I will get together for Washington County, but I didn't, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really see, other than the RTP call for project discussion.
Thank you. I'm pulling up the agenda. just had.
Yeah, and there's a.
And I looked over it briefly, but we had the big discussion point was last month, right? Was the big vote on the RTP, which then went on to Garrett and the Metro Council, which they passed. So yeah, I looked through it, nothing. It's like almost an attendance grade.
Right.
Sorry, my kiddo is dragging
No
my
problem.
hand. I had to tell.
We were trying to figure out what kind of disembodied action you were having there.
Yeah, I know, right? I was like, somebody's dragging me. But yeah, I don't see any other. I guess we'll be reviewing the draft regional mobility policy and implementation plan. And that's an action item. So Stephen, how should we address on that to get the group's input? And then I guess, Jeff, that will be you. If Mayor Callaway is not going to be there, that will be you. So
Well, I thought the
action item.
message was pretty clear from the other mayors, right? It's pushing 99W up from 4 to 1. I mean, is there anything else I'm supposed to be talking about on this?
I think, so there's a consent items. I apologize. I was busy pulling up the agenda and I missed the topic.
Oh, you know what? I think I'm wrong, Stephen.
That's last month, isn't it?
Or even longer, but
Oh, okay.
yeah, I
Because
don't
I
know
did
what I was
pitch.
looking at.
I did pitch that we needed to move 99W up from 4 to 1.
Right.
Yes, I was incorrect. Yeah, Stephen, you're correct.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So
yeah.
I saw the Safe Streets for All Transportation
Yep,
Safety Update. So that's a grant that
Yeah, no action
several of us
item.
partnered
Sorry.
together on for an information briefing. Sunrise Corridor Visioning project update from Clackamas County.
Yep.
And then another update on the regional freight delay and commodities study.
Yeah, sorry about that, Jeff. There's no action items.
Okay, good. I didn't misread it. I didn't read the wrong month. That's okay.
No,
I was like,
I think
I was
looking
thinking there was
at the wrong,
nothing big this month. That's why I got one
notes.
big
I was
month
looking at
last month, and this month it's like,
no,
thanks for attending.
no, just the informational and discussion only.
Okay,
So
good. I didn't misread it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I did want to note too, they do have the JPAC work plan discussion on there. So similar to the conversation we were having about your committee, I think we'll also, Jessica and I will be reviewing the JPAC and impact work plans and using that to help populate the WCCC work plan as well.
And we've got a staff review on that, I think tomorrow, right, Stephen, tomorrow evening. Our JPAC meeting, I think, is 5 o'clock tomorrow, I think, for review.
Okay.
No.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I think you've got one and then I've got one. Denise. I think we're gonna have two different times.
I'm gonna stay quiet. I'm gonna mute myself. Yes.
That's okay. That's okay. If we had one more meeting, where would we stick it in, right?
Spare time.
Right, spare time. We all got that. Everybody here has spare time, right?
All right. So I guess we'll move on now to item F, the MPAC agenda. Mayor Rosner. Did he leave? Where'd Tim go?
That's what I was gonna ask.
Tim?
Might have lost Mayor Rosner. Yeah.
All right.
And I'm pretty sure the agenda is not published yet. It's typically.
It's usual, yeah.
After, yeah, and we're actually meeting a week early. I don't know. Well, no, I'm sorry. Rather, impact is this week, isn't it?
Impact is on Wednesday.
That's right. Yeah, we're off cycle this week. Yeah. So the Sherwood concept plan, I think, is maybe the feature topic.
That's right. And the update on the buildable lands inventory, actually, from Aaron and Ted.
Okay.
So, similar presentation.
All right. That brings us to item number 5, other business and agency updates. I'm going to ask Mayor Lube and Mayor Wenzel. Is Mayor Wenzel still here? She's probably back in school. Region 1 Act update. Anything new and exciting, Heidi?
No, we met last Monday. Had a couple of presentations, talked about the Interstate Bridge program and ODOT revenue forecasts, no general surprises. I think there's a really hard push to try to figure out sort of a work plan and a purpose as far as what the acts are responsible for, which is anticipated to be a pretty robust conversation next, I believe, excuse me, probably January of next year.
Okay. We talked about this a little bit earlier about it's my understanding, Commissioner Fye, that the STRAC is done meeting, that you've wrapped up your business.
Last month was our last meeting.
All right. And then as far as the RTAC is continuing to meet. Mayor Lube gave a little bit of a summary about one of the topics. Do you have any else to add about the meeting, Heidi?
No, I think just in general, the conversation was really, it came from a place where everybody was asking for, how did you get to what you're presenting to us so we can understand? And a lot of it came from the financial numbers and just assumptions that they were making. And I think Commissioner Savas really pointed out that diversion is happening now and it's creating a lot of challenges in his community, whereas the presentation sort of from ODOT and the assumptions weren't taking into account that any of that was already taking place. And that was a point that he wanted to make pretty robustly. So I think that gets you caught up.
All right. Yeah, there was a video put out from West Lynn of the backlog of diversion vehicles on Willamette Falls Drive and how long it was backed up on Willamette Falls, starting at the downtown, if you will, of West Lynn. It was just dramatic, and ODOT is failing to recognize that already exists now and will get worse. But Stephen, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to add, this primarily affects our friends and banks primarily, but there's also a Northwest Act meeting this Tuesday, just a short virtual 1-hour meeting, and the focus of that is a vote on the Northwest Act work plan and then discussion of the OTC strategic action plan. But I was just thinking, based on Mayor Lube's reminder that Region 1 Act is working on its work plan, Northwest Act, which is sort of the Region 2 Act, will be looking at its work plan.
Anything else for the good of the order? We might get out a little early, a little Christmas holiday gift, if you will. Anyone have anything to offer up? Nope. I think Mayor Beatty's like, I'll take the 15 minutes and run. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and call this meeting closed. Have a terrific Christmas, Hanukkah, and Happy New Year. And Kwanzaa too. I got to get them all in there. Have a terrific afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.